that we deal with is, on the one hand, we prioritize and privilege national ownership. So we understand, or it's our assessment, that real progress in peace building is unlikely to occur in a sustainable and meaningful way if the authorities that run a country are not committed to tackling some of the most difficult questions. So if you want to talk about historical grievances, transitional justice, human rights, how you manage a country's wealth in a way that is balanced across different groups or geographical regions, if you're really going to make progress in these areas, if you're going to tackle corruption, if you're going to make progress in these areas, the government has a huge role to play and really needs to be committed to do it. At the same time, what you're asking governments to tackle are indeed some of the most difficult things, and not just a question of perhaps philosophy, but a question of real politics. The ability of people who have been often fighting for years, who are now in some kind of government of compromise or unity or transition, to not only manage the immediate post-conflict period of recent conflict, but to then gain some consensus, garner some consensus on how to tackle some of these difficult issues. It's a big challenge. And I think the premise of the Peacebuilding Fund is, and that's why we're a post-conflict fund, our premise is that we will only declare a country eligible, the Secretary General will declare a country eligible, when this commitment, there is some evidence to believe that a government has put itself into that position and is willing to tackle some of these tough issues. The mechanism that we have to do this, the other challenge in post-conflict settings is, of course, that institutions, government institutions, all institutions, often United Nations institutions, but especially government institutions, tend to be weak. So you're trying to manage respecting national ownership on the one hand, requiring the political commitment or hoping to encourage political commitment to tackle tough issues from that government or by that government, and you're dealing with a very weak institutional setting in which the government has perhaps quite simply limited money, but certainly limited institutional and human resources. Those who created us designed a simple mechanism called a joint steering committee to tackle all this. And the idea is that in a post-conflict country, you have a committee co-chaired by the government and by the United Nations. Hopefully there's also civil society and other development partners involved. And that this committee gives lots of opportunity to the government to set priorities, but then has United Nations organizations actually implementing activities and providing technical assistance to the government to handle the questions of weak capacity. Let me get into some examples to talk a little bit about how this works. In Liberia, so a few examples from Liberia. But one of the areas that we've worked in over the last several years is on the question of land and land conflict. It's a big issue in most those conflict countries, and certainly in Liberia. There, the government set up a special land commission to look at the issue. The government nominated or put at the head of this land commission a very dedicated, intelligent, politically savvy, and committed individual. He's done a lot of really interesting work. They've established alternative dispute resolution centers for looking at land conflict. They've set 5 of them up around the country. I think the figures last year were that about 100 people a week were walking into those 5 centers and getting them to help address land issues. The alternative dispute resolution centers were looking at tribal authority or traditional authorities, but also to the formal justice system and to the local governments, and trying to find a way through in an alternative approach to solving some of these issues. So, this is for us a nice example of how it's supposed to work. Government is committed. Government has put good people on the issue. The United Nations, in this case through UN Habitat, our funding goes through UN Habitat, is providing assistance to these alternative dispute resolution mechanisms, and they've even raised more money. So one of the conditions of our donors is that we're, relatively speaking, a small fund when you consider that we're global, and they want us to be catalytic. We're not the scale-up peace-building resources fund. We're the small catalytic peace-building fund. So the Land Commission in Liberia is sort of an example of how we think this all should work. We have another project in Liberia, which we endearingly refer to as the hubs inside the office. These are justice and security hubs. Of the analyses that were undertaken by many partners, but including the peacekeeping mission. There's a peacekeeping mission, of course, UNMIL in Liberia. And they were quite concerned about the concentration of resources in the capital city, Monrovia, and the lack of presence of government and of services of any kind outside of Monrovia. One of the areas, of course, health and education are receiving lots of attention from other development partners. So one of the gaps that they saw that was appropriate for the Peacebuilding Fund to deal with was justice and security. There was an idea that one could, not exactly decentralize, but get more services out of the capital city and closer to the population, the rural population, by creating hubs that would cover several counties. Liberia administratively is split into 15 counties. So there are 5 justice and security hubs on the planning books. One has already been completed. The idea is to put gendarmerie and police and border security and justice officials all inside one hub, and that this hub of security and justice services to the population in the counties that are covered. Now, this one is a little bit more challenging for a couple of reasons. We've encountered a zillion logistical delays, which are perhaps understandable for construction in rural Liberia. We've encountered a lot of challenges in dealing with government around the different branches of government that are involved. So you have the judiciary involved, you have the Ministry of Justice involved, and you have the Ministry of the Interior involved to oversee the police. And getting them to work together, even to agree on what should be inside the hub, turned out to be more of a challenge than we thought. But perhaps our biggest concern is around how the institutions in the hub actually behave. So if the government of Liberia over the last decades has not, through the crisis, has obviously not been a model of providing democratic law and order and human rights respecting law and order, yes, we want to extend the services out of Monrovia closer to the population, but we want to be extending good services closer to the population. And then, in fact, in Liberia, it happens from time to time that police stations get burned down by the population as an expression of their discontent. And we've always been rather scared that this new model joint facility would, in fact, draw the attention of discontent as opposed to being a model of delivering good services. And what we're fussing with now, so far, we have some evidence that things are improving a little bit. One of the things that we push our partners to think about are the perceptions of citizens, and to say to governments, yes, national ownership, and yes, you really are, as the authorities of the country, need to take the steps, and we want to support you in that. But what we're supporting you in is not just constructing a more powerful state. We're supporting you to construct a state that is more oriented around a relationship with its citizens that is one that is appreciated by and beneficial to the citizens. And one of the, I mean, it's a small little bureaucratic thing, but one of the things that we argue is that you need to measure that. So yes, we'll provide the cars or the concrete and build the courthouses, provide radios. We do all those things with taxpayer dollars, with your taxpayer dollars. But we also negotiate with the authorities that we want you measuring not just whether the building was built or the car was delivered, but we want you measuring how the citizens themselves are perceiving the change in services from the state. And that's, you know, this is going to be a long, it's going to be a long struggle. It's a generational struggle. It's not something that gets fixed from today to tomorrow. But we do think it is an important sort of signal that we're serious about what's happening to people at the end of the line, and not just about building institutional state structures. So in Banga County, which is where this first hub was, there was a baseline sort of survey of perceptions of the population, and there's been a follow-up survey, and a little bit of an increase in terms of their own perception of how the government has been. And really, this is the core issue, which is, you know, how do you say yes to national ownership and support the government, but how do you do that in a way where you're pushing all the time that citizens have a right to a human rights respecting and democratic behaving state, and not, you're not just somehow contributing to the extension of state authority is a phrase that gets used a lot in peacekeeping missions. And what we occasionally worry about is, we want to be careful that we're not extending a predatory state authority, because that will not only not be helpful, but indeed harmful. Maybe I'll switch to one other example here, which is Burundi. Burundi should also be, and I would say until maybe 18 months ago, I would have put it on the list with Liberia as a sort of hopeful place that is going in the right direction. It's been of more concern over the last 18 months. We have agreed to provide more funding to Burundi, and what we're trying to do with that funding is identify areas that are of interest to government, but which also provide us a bit of an entry point into addressing some of the tough issues. So actually one of the good news stories in Burundi is the National Human Rights Commission. So the Burundian government itself has established an independent National Human Rights Commission. We've been funding it for several years. One of the things that I think we did right, in collaboration with the Peacebuilding Commission actually, is agree to fund it for a long time, but actually not fund it until the Parliament passed the law to legally establish it. So we provided some preparatory assistance, and we indicated a willingness to provide support to it, but didn't actually fund it until the law was passed in Parliament. Now, that kind of goes against the grain of standard development financing, because normally you have a project and you have 12 months and you want to implement the project in 12 months. But we think what is particularly, honestly, I think it's the case in all development work, but it is particularly true in post-conflict peacebuilding work, that pretty much everything you do is politicized, and you want to not ignore that or pretend it doesn't exist, but in fact you want to engage with it and try to find a way to influence with your sort of public sector resources, as it were, the political evolution in a positive way. In Burundi, there's an example of how we did that. Good news on the National Human Rights Commission. More recently, what we're concerned about in particular is the behavior of the ruling political parties as a youth wing, and the youth wing is engaging in activities that are decidedly not helpful. And so we're trying to have, the challenge we face is, how do we have this structure which is about national ownership and puts national ownership front and center and has a joint steering committee that is co-chaired by government, but for which one of your most concerning issues are the behavior of the youth wing of the ruling political party, and yet they're co-chairing your committee. How do you square that circle? I'm using up my 20 minutes rapidly, so there's a couple of ways that I think we need to square that circle. The first is we need the assistance of bilateral development partners. So on our joint steering committees, we try hard to not just have it be a UN government committee, but we want the US government, the Norwegian government, the European Union, whoever it is, also sitting on those committees, many of whom are both supportive of the United Nations, but occasionally critical of the United Nations, and get them to participate in some of these public discussions, which are not easy. And you find is that sometimes bilateral partners are not so willing to necessarily use up some of their political capital in making tough points on a joint steering committee that's about a not necessarily very big United Nations fund. But we need the political partners, the bilateral partners, because they're often able to reinforce some of the messages that are not always so easy. Secondly, there's a tremendous dependence for us upon United Nations leadership at country level. So where we have a peacekeeping mission that's led by a special representative of the Secretary General, where we have, if there isn't a Security Council mission in the country, resident coordinators, they have tremendous influence over the ability to use resources like ours, which can be a little bit more political, which can take risks, which can put some conditions on its financing, as I told the story about the Human Rights Commission. Really, we need leaders that are interested and willing to engage in the politics of the setting, and to have, be skillful diplomatically enough that they can have difficult conversations in a way that doesn't destroy relationships between the United Nations and its government. But they also need support politically from New York. And I think one of the things that member states can do, including the Norwegian government, is continue to think in New York about how can UN leadership at country level be reinforced or backed up or supported politically in New York so that she or he is able to carry forward some of these difficult conversations in a way that is not just descends into disagreement, but is actually able to progress. I don't know how much time I have. Yeah. Fine. So let me just talk a little bit about relapse. As I mentioned earlier on, the Peacebuilding Fund is not uniquely focused on the Peacebuilding Commission, but we accord a high priority to it. There are 6 countries on the Peacebuilding Commission that I mentioned earlier. Of those 6, 2 over the last couple of years have completely relapsed into conflict, violence, and non-constitutional change of government. Is the way I usually refer to it, Guinea-Bissau and Central African Republic. Burundi, as I mentioned, is in a challenging and somewhat contentious moment. The American Samantha Power was there yesterday, meeting with the president. And Guinea, earlier this year, Guinea-Conakry seems to be on a good path again, but was in crisis most of last year around legislative election. So, of the 6 countries on the PBC agenda, 2 have fully relapsed, and another 2, at least last year, were in a difficult position. So, it doesn't exactly look good for the success rate of countries coming on the Peacebuilding agenda. Somewhat defensively, I suppose, our view in New York is that this underscores the difficulty of doing peacebuilding work, the fragility of post-conflict settings, and how hard it is to really come to agreements that bring together years of grievance and hope that it all gets fixed quickly. As the Peacebuilding Fund, how have we dealt with this? In both Central African Republic and in Guinea-Bissau, when there were coups in both of those countries, we suspended our financing. This was a bit of an unusual step, I think, for the United Nations. Inside the UN, we received a little bit of pushback on this front, saying, no, this is not the time to abandon the country, this is the time to work even more harder, and we shouldn't abandon the people. To which my response was, of course the United Nations should not be abandoning the people of Central African Republic or Guinea-Bissau, absolutely not. And there are many wings and institutions within the United Nations that should be providing support to the people. But as the Peacebuilding Fund, and if we put such a privilege on national ownership and the evidence of commitment of the authorities to tackling the tough issues, and if we believe that those tough issues are not really likely to be addressed in a meaningful way without the commitment of the authorities, well then goodness gracious, the government that went to the Commission and said, we'd like your assistance, the government that signed up to the programs that we assigned was not. It was in exile or hiding or has fled the country. And so it only makes sense. It would be illogical for us as a somewhat political related fund to somehow stay engaged. We stand by that policy, and our advisory group has supported it. We have nuanced it a little bit, though, and we actually have 2 facilities inside the Peacebuilding Fund. We have a sort of main track, which is the one I've been talking about with Joint Steering Committee. We have a small little emergency window where we can fund projects by project. And what we're doing in both Guinea-Bissau and in Central African Republic is, as soon as it looks like there is a political pathway negotiated that looks like it offers an opportunity for countries to return to constitutional order, but without necessarily waiting for the election, right? What has tended to happen in years past is that everybody waits for the election. It's only after the election that you do stuff. We're a little worried about what that puts too much emphasis on elections themselves, and that can be a whole topic of conversation. But also, we want to engage more early. So what we've said is, as soon as it looks like there's a pathway towards peace around which there is some political support, both within the country and outside the country, then we will begin to use not our big facility with joint steering committees and so on. For that, we do want to wait for a longer-term government, but to use our other emergency facility to come in and provide some programs. And let me just give you a couple of examples of those. Guinea-Bissau actually doesn't get a lot of attention, but it should get some attention. It's going through an interesting moment right now. The Secretary General's special representative is Jose Ramos Horta, who was the former president of Timor-Leste and Nobel Peace Prize winner. And so he's got a little street cred, as it were, in Guinea-Bissau. talks to the authorities in a slightly different way. He says, look, I've run a small post-conflict country, and so I know of what I speak, and he's been a little bit tough with them. One of his ideas, which I think is quite interesting, is he's established a high-level commission before the elections. So he said, right, we need elections, and he's been negotiating with both the government and the European Union and others about when those elections should take place. But what he has said to the government is, let's create a high-level planning commission that involves the elite from many different quarters of society. Let's get them to sit down before the elections and talk about what are the priorities for our country going forward, so that whoever wins the election afterwards has already a bit of a roadmap that is presented by the elite from all the political parties that says, we all kind of agreed before we knew who was going to win that these would be important things to do. And does it bind the new government into following it? Of course not. But does it provide a little bit of some railway tracks that they should perhaps follow, and some means for the rest of us to help argue and navigate and negotiate with the government? Hopefully it does. So we've used our emergency facility along with the Department of Political Affairs. In Central African Republic, which you've seen on the news, we're doing a similar thing. We did suspend our larger program, but we're working on some smaller projects. One of them is support to the police and the gendarmerie. Again, it's perhaps not what you think of first when you see Central African Republic on the news, but the idea is to try and support civilian security authorities and provide a little bit of support to the new government in their efforts to try to have their own institutions provide some security. It is symbolic, and it is political, and it is risky, because there's a pretty good chance that those police stations that we're rebuilding will become trashed, is the word that comes to head. I was trying to think of the more academic term. Broken again. Another project we're focusing on is human rights. So the High Commissioner, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, does have a presence in Central African Republic through the Security Council mandated mission there. But we provided resources in December, in a couple of days actually. It was quite quick to beef up the human rights presence, because in December was when there was a major increase in violence and an increase in concern in the situation there. So we put some money into human rights. And what we're working on right now is support to salaries. So the government, salaries haven't been paid until last month. They hadn't been paid since last September. Central African Republic is a very small country. The economies are largely informal, so without salaries being paid to civil servants, a lot of the informal economy that is built around that small but reliable source of financing collapses. The economy as a whole had collapsed because the Muslim-Christian issue had resulted in Muslims fleeing the country. As you know, they were the principal traders of all the meat in the country, so the economy was collapsing. So we were looking at how we could provide some support to salaries, both as a symbolic gesture of support to the political authorities, the new political authorities, in which there is some, I think, a sense of some hope on the part of Central African Republic's partners. So a symbolic support to the government, real support to at least not letting the state structure entirely deflate, and also a quick injection of resources into the economy by allowing some resources back. In the end, the government themselves did 1 month of payment through support from a neighboring country, and we're going to work with the World Bank using our comparative advantage, which is our ability to get into the political sector. So the bank and ourselves will provide 4 more months of salaries. The bank will do the civilian side of government salaries, and we will do the police and gendarmerie that the bank can't do. So we're trying to use our sort of risk-taking and our more political ability to partner with the bank and try and, as quickly as possible, now that there is a new authority in place, support that to sort of re-achieve a more stable and get back on a path towards peace. I better stop there. There's a lot of things I could have talked about. I haven't talked much about how the UN works together. I haven't talked about the New Deal. The Peacebuilding Fund ourselves have just gone through a review and draft findings about it. I haven't talked about it, so there's lots more I can talk about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I guess you can come back to some of that issue during the question session. I'll just give the floor to Morten now to offer his comments.
Thank you, Eli, and thank you, Brian, for a very interesting introduction to the work of the Peacebuilding Fund and the complexities of the landscapes where it's trying to do its work. I want to save time also for the audience to comment and ask questions, so I'm not going to talk for very long, but just a couple of observations based on both more generic presentation of the work of the fund and some of the few cases that you went into, like for instance Liberia and Burundi. Let me start by with Liberia and Burundi, and then I'll say a little bit about also how I see the fund's work in some of these countries that are relapsing into conflict. But if we stay at least with one of the more positive of these countries, but also I think Burundi says something of the same, because yes, I mean, you pointed out, and I mean, I don't think that any of us disagree with the importance of some sort of a national ownership to this, and that we need some sort of government commitment, otherwise it becomes very, very difficult. But as I think also about the cases of particularly Burundi, but perhaps also Liberia highlights, is that, I mean, in theory, I mean, the parts of the work of the Peacebuilding Fund is an attempt to have some sort of a light footprint spread approach. I mean, it's not supposed to be sort of go in full and basically assume sovereignty, but work together with a sovereign partner. But I mean, I think that, as you highlighted in the case of Burundi, I mean, this also it's still, I mean, there is a problematic here that I don't think they have been able really to work out, and maybe it's not even possible because it's so difficult. Because what the case of Burundi shows, as you highlighted, is the ambiguity of attempting to achieve a national ownership when the government in question is also part of the problem as well as the solution. And I think this is sort of very much at the heart of the matter here. And it's no easy solution to this, but maybe it's a need for it to be even more acknowledged than it is today. And I would like to sort of, based on your experience, to have your some comments from you on this particular sort of dilemma, that whether we like it or not. I mean, if we are going to achieve anything through a mechanism as the Peacebuilding Fund, we will have to work together with governments that, due to the very fact that there are governments in countries that recently has come out of a conflict, these governments are never perfect. They are a part of what was also there in the first place, and thereby they also sort of seems to conjure up some of the cleavages and issues that brought these countries into conflict in the first place. And this also means that it's not necessarily so difficult to understand why a new police hub or a police station may be burned down, because in certain areas, I mean, whether it's in Burundi or Liberia, I mean, governments still lack legitimacy. Building the Banga hub in Nimba may have been the easy one. I think it would be much more difficult to try to establish something like that, for instance, in neighboring Grand Gede. Because, I mean, then you will sort of venture into what was one of the underlying dimensions of the Liberian civil war, and that is the conflict between the Crown and the Giwa and the Mano. And if you look at sort of how these issues was played out also in the most recent Liberian election, I mean, we see that in the 2011 election, we see that these underlying cleavages are still very much part of Liberian politics and society. So I'm not saying that this is not necessarily meant as a critique of the work of the Peacebuilding Fund, but I mean, we just have to face up to it, that we are facing dilemmas and contradictions when we try to achieve things in these kinds of societies. And we need to acknowledge these kind of dilemmas and contradictions, and perhaps acknowledge them a little bit better than we are doing today. Because to me, and again, I mean, this is not meant as a critique of the Peacebuilding Fund as such, but the Peacebuilding Fund is part of this. It's part of international architecture of peace building, which is carried out in some of the weakest countries, most volatile countries in the world, which also has the lowest institutional capacity. And I'm slightly afraid that we are asking some of these countries to try to achieve too much too soon. And is it a role for the Peacebuilding Fund also within this, trying to address that question? Because I mean, I couldn't help thinking about this last night when it was news coverage on Norwegian news media about the visit of the President of Ireland to London and the dinner at Windsor Hall. And one of the sort of main news items here was that Martin McGuinness was present. And I think that's great, that's fine. But I mean, there seems to me to be a certain difference between sort of how the whole peace settlement of Northern Ireland has been tried implemented extremely pragmatically, and some of the immensely sort of strong rights-based positions that we take in countries which are much, much weaker and much more volatile than ever was the case of Northern Ireland and England. And I think we may need to rethink some of this. We need, and maybe this is where the Peacebuilding Fund play a larger role, acknowledging the sheer fact that we are living in a very imperfect world, where at the very best, what we may be able to achieve, for instance, in a place like the Central African Republic, is an imperfect solution that at least prevents some of the killing, and take this place, if not back to square one, at least back to a slightly more stable situation, which also can help address what I believe is one of the underlying issues of the whole Central African conflict, and that is this almost permanent conflict in this part of Africa between herders and farmers. I mean, I believe that way too much emphasis is put on the religious dimension of the conflict, and way too little is put on the sheer fact that who are the Muslims who are driven out of Central African Republic. It's the Pearl, the Fulanis, who are the herdsmen, and how this relates to that part of the political economy. And it would be fascinating, and I think also immensely valuable if the Peacebuilding Fund could be used to address also some of these underlying grievances, and not only dealing with these issues that are at the surface and catches the attention of the world because it ties into this kind of larger conflict between sort of Christian Muslims. It gives us ideas about the possible new conflict, the global war on terror, and these kind of things. So maybe, I mean, I'll sort of leave with that challenge that I think that parts of, and I would like to have your opinion about this question. To what extent do you foresee that in the future work of the Peacebuilding Commission that it can sort of try to work with governments or parts of governments to slightly increase the limited space that they have for maneuverability internally, due to the fact that these governments are caught up in all these kind of internal contradictions and cleavages? And secondly, how and in what way the Peacebuilding Fund can be addressed to address some of these very important underlying issues, like, for instance, this conflict between herders and farmers that we see all over this part of the Sahel, which the Central African Republic is part of. To address some of these and sort of being thereby slightly being a corrective to what at a certain point becomes the dominant narrative about the conflict. There, I think it would be a very interesting role for the Peacebuilding Fund. And since you already have been involved in these issues concerning land rights and land conflict in Liberia, which I think shows some promise, even though it's, again, I mean, it's far from perfect, and nobody really believed it would be perfect either. because I mean the person that you talked about, I mean, has been up against a lot of resistance also internally in the government. I still remember a meeting the superintendent from NIMBA who told them in plain language 2 years ago that if it was up to him, and he was very convinced that it would be up to him, the Land Commission would never play a role in NIMBA County. So that also says something of the internal, and this is the man that has been handpicked by the president as the superintendent of the NIMBA. So it says something about the kind of forces also that one is up to and how deeply rooted these conflicts are. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. I think we'll take a couple of questions from for now, and we can reply to them at the same time.
The question. Do you work with the grassroots, with the population itself, with, for instance, non-violent communication?
Identify yourself also.
My name is Rolf. I'm retired from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I have a certain experience with peacekeeping, peace building in particularly Latin American countries, not so much Africa. And I hesitate to make too many comments because in my experience it's too complex and conditions will vary in Latin America, South Africa, and vice versa. Still, I have one reflection and one question. One is a reflection upon this very famous word, concept, national ownership. I've never been to a country where I could point and say, there you have a classical, great example of national ownership. It doesn't really exist in my work. But then you are maybe a little bit pessimistic. But what I found worked in some areas is really to say that, you know, okay, that is to talk to the leaders of the country and really stress and be severe about what they should do and point out, sometimes diplomatically, sometimes not so diplomatically, what will be the consequences if you don't follow this particular advice. Because then he could use this approach when going to some of his or her, let's say, more conservative backers and say, I don't like to do this, you know my position as, but I mean, if we don't, the international community will come down very hard on us. That sometimes helps. It's not the recipe for universal method, but sometimes it helps. So much for national ownership. Then a question on the relapse factor. In your opinion, I won't talk very much about the fund or the commission, but let's say about the relapse factor, which is quite a problem. If you look at mechanisms, settlements which have, let's say, laid to rest a certain conflict, if you look historically, empirically at these kind of settlements which we have had in Latin America and Africa, now, which type settlements hold the best guarantees that there will be no relapse? I'm asking the question because sometimes I hear that if you have a situation in a country where, let's say, the UN has intervened too early and the parties haven't really finished fighting, then there is the risk of relapse. Now, if you have a situation where the parties have fought the issues out and are ready to go back to the negotiating table, then this has a better chance. I mean, it's a kind of primitive question, but let's say empirically, have you any reflections on which kind of mechanisms will hold good and relapse and prevent relapse? Thank you.
Thank you. By now, we'll take another round of questions. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you for your interest and for the questions. Maybe I'll go to the floor first and come back to Morten at the end. With respect to grassroots organizations, the Peacebuilding Fund is a United Nations fund. My institution, the Peacebuilding Support Office, is not operational. We don't have offices in the field. Our funding goes through those UN organizations that are already at country level, and we're essentially responding to the strategies that the UN comes up with at country level to promote peace building. Absolutely, those strategies can include working with civil society, and they often do. And communications is in fact a big issue that is often raised as an area of work. We've often funded, you're going to ask me where, Central African Republic before the relapse for sure, on some other places as well, on local radios. So access to information in many poor rural societies is difficult, and there are local radio stations set up. So I can't think of a local NGO that's specifically dedicated to non-violent communication off the top of my head, but we can work with civil society. But we do it through United Nations organizations, not directly. I mean, the national ownership question, which maybe ties in with your comments as well, Morten. Maybe you don't, from your position today, perhaps you have the luxury of saying that you don't recognize really what national ownership means.
No, I understood.
Okay. I don't think any of us fully, I mean, you know, I work in the United Nations in New York, and the halls of the UN in New York are full of negotiating between contradictory points of view in which particular phrases allow some agreement and some way to move forward. And national ownership is a classic example of such a phrase, which allows a variety of viewpoints of member states to agree to move forward. Right? How, for sure, at a simplistic level, national ownership for us means that the government, the authorities, have a large vote, if not a determining vote, in what it is that you're going to try and do. Our interest is to expand the concept of national ownership as much as possible to get beyond governments and to involve citizens somehow. Right? So now how do you do that? You can't impose a democratic order for your own little fund, right? That makes no sense. But what you can do is try to encourage, and in fact, Cedric de Koning, who is a member of our advisory group, I should mention, and was in New York with us just last week, was encouraging us to consider some ideas such as, okay, fine, you have your joint steering committees that I mentioned, but why not have civil society advisory groups or advisory groups that sit outside that joint steering committee? So fine, the joint steering committee needs to be co-chaired by government, and they're the ones that ultimately take decisions. But you can help build the practice of being more consultative and having governments answer to difficult questions by creating a forum that's an advisory group that gets more civil society and community representatives who can at least learn about your programs and ask more questions about your program. It's modeling, in essence, democratic behavior. Is it a panacea? Does it solve everything overnight? Clearly not. But are they the small steps that we should be sort of incrementally pushing all the time? I think probably so. Another thing we want to work on, or another idea we want to try in some countries, is actually contracting local civil society organizations to do monitoring. So rather than building in-house to a UN program its own monitoring of the program, you actually give a contract to a local NGO whose job it is to take a look at, okay, so how is this hub in Banga County really working? And the NGO's got connections into the community that perhaps the UN organization or the government doesn't, and provides another feedback channel from the citizens. So, you know, national ownership is a problem. I was the head of UN AIDS in Myanmar for 4 years, not the new Myanmar, but 2004 to 2008, which was a different time in Myanmar. And I used to say, there's two things I used to say. One was, you should never have a comfortable meeting with government. Like, almost every meeting, you needed to negotiate is a word that in the UN, you know, we don't like to use the word negotiate because we're technical people and development is technical, so there's nothing to negotiate over. It's just empirically right or wrong. You know, you put the well here or you put the well there. But I think negotiate is not a dirty word. Negotiate is a word we should all be comfortable with. As far as I'm concerned, my job is to spend taxpayer money. Most of the taxpayer money that I receive is from countries that are themselves democratic and have democratic rules associated with the expenditure of that money in their own country. So if I'm coming to help somebody else's country, I shouldn't be shy about the fact that actually I would like to have democratic standards associated with the particular funding that we're bringing into the country. So I think we should be willing to negotiate more, and that means negotiating around things like, yes, you're the government and you have rights, but it's also about the end state, it's about your citizens' perceptions about whatever. The second thing I used to say in Myanmar was, we need to do it because we got criticized all the time from the outside, probably from organizations based in Norway, for being government stooges. You know, we lived in Myanmar at the time and underneath, so you know we were duped and we didn't understand what was happening. And I said that you have to deal with the government because they run the checkpoints. They have the power. So if you want to try to engage with and change the situation, you need to engage with the powers that be. So it doesn't mean that you're supporting them or you necessarily like them, but for sure, the fact that your picture shows up, they used to criticize the resident coordinator, Charles Petrie. They used to criticize him because he'd show up with newspapers shaking hands with government officials, and the external community would say, you see, he's a government stooge. There's his picture. It's silly. So national ownership is tricky, it's complicated, it's multifaceted, but we should be using that ambiguity aggressively. We should be pushing it all the time, and we should be negotiating. And I think it goes a little bit to what the Peacebuilding Fund can do. I think we have the advantage of having a bit more of an explicit mandate to do so. So whereas a UNICEF or a UNEP might get quite nervous about stopping its funding for a political reason or engaging into areas that are more sensitive, we're actually supposed to do that. And so for UN leaders on the ground who are interested to enter into territories that are a bit more sensitive, we can go to them and say, you can use our money for these areas. We have no problem with it being a little bit more sensitive, and you can stop it and start it and hold it out and use it to help negotiate some of these issues because we actually have a specific mandate to do so. Which kinds of settlements are most likely to persist? I mean, that's $1 million question. So I don't have a big answer to that. I mean, some of the things we're saying, inclusivity is a big issue these days. We talk about inclusivity a lot. And so it's the idea that government agreements need to get beyond an elite deal that may temporarily stop fighting, but not have deep roots into historical grievances. So the way you get at the root causes, the way you get at the more historical grievances, is you're inclusive enough in your negotiation that our communities are reflected in those agreements. Irrespective of the sort of representational nature of a particular community, the truth is somehow recognized, and the community's historical grievance is recognized in the agreement. I think some would say that the South Sudan story is a little bit that at the moment, which is that you have a sort of power sharing. You had a power sharing deal that ultimately fell apart, but wasn't really getting into some of the deeper issues of conflict within South Sudan. And one of the things that one of the efforts that's being made currently in South Sudan, partly prompted by the IGAD negotiation, which is encouraging a broader consultation across South Sudan society than previously had been the case. But there's a couple of other efforts too. There's a civil society effort. There's even a parliamentarian effort in South Sudan, all of which are trying to, I think they've tried to come together. I had a meeting about it last week, but they're trying to look at how can we create a broader dialogue and discourse across South Sudan society so that whatever the next agreement is, if there will be another agreement sooner or later, whatever that next agreement is, does a better job of reflecting some community concerns and not just being an elite power deal. At the same time, you need to do the elite power deal because they run the checkpoints, and you need to get them to run the checkpoints a little bit differently in the short run. If you don't get through the short run, there is no long run. Right? So you're trying to balance. These two things. In terms of root causes, one last comment. I don't think we're certainly happy to address root causes, and we're trying to do so in the land issue, for example. We do respond to, let's say, country-level demand and the analyses coming out of countries, and it hasn't come out very often, root causes between the agriculturalists and the shepherds and herders. It's come up. It came up a little bit in northern Uganda when we did some work there. So it's interesting. It's a good. I will take that question back. I don't know why that one hasn't come up more often. Certainly, I couldn't agree more forcefully with you that in Central African Republic, the religious thing is an instrumentalization by people who are fighting over things that are not about religion. I think I was reading an interview of the SRSG General Guy in Burundi yesterday, where he struggles with this, with the BBC and others. He struggled with this question because we're clearly concerned about the religious dimension and the potential for that to both spread and to deepen and become a more genuine cause of grievance. In fact, it's already become, to some degree, a genuine cause of grievance. At the same time, we want to go out of our way to continually emphasize that at root, the conflict is not about religion. It's about group communities and their access to resources. So certainly agree very strongly.
We are running out of time, but I have two more people on my list, so take very quick questions from them. The gentleman in front.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Just all we know that about the peacebuilding and peacekeeping, like my was already not private since the previous Secretary General of the United Nations. Yes, my question is the similarity of the three countries, Central Africa and Liberia and South. Yes, we want to know, just to set some rights over the supplement of peacebuilding fund over in the south of Sudan, because there is some criticizing oriented to this. Some of the main problems that what is called in the South Sudan established DDR Commission, the denuclearization and integration and disarmament commission in South Sudan to provide financial assistance and funds from financial assistance from this fund. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My name is Robin Silver. I work here at NUPI. And thank you both for, I think, very honest contributions to your work and for discussing. I was just wondering if you had the time maybe to say something more about perceptions of citizens that you discussed. So how, in your experience with the local government, with authorities, how do they receive this idea of pushing them into thinking how does the citizens respond and see, for instance, the development of the local justice, police, and so on. If you can say something about that, and also perhaps if you can mention how you would bureaucratically measure this, as you pointed to. Thank you.
Yeah, and we'll have to.
Okay, thanks. With respect to DDR disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, we're not funding any DDR work in South Sudan. The Peacebuilding Fund did in 2010. We declared Sudan eligible. The Secretary General declared Sudan eligible for the Peacebuilding Fund in 2010. So at that time, it was all one country. And some funding did go into DDR based through Khartoum. When independence was declared for South Sudan, the DDR program that we had funded essentially remained in the Republic of Sudan. In the South, none of our funding has gone into DDR. We did receive some requests early on to look at it, but frankly, the scale of operations in South Sudan in the security sector and in DDR was way beyond what we could do anything about. I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think the government was spending about $50 million a month on the army in South Sudan. And as I mentioned earlier, we have about $100 million globally a year. So the government of South Sudan, as poor as it is, was spending as much money as we had globally every 2 months. So we decided for the South that the DDR didn't make much sense for peacebuilding. But that kind of dodges your question, which is the challenge of DDR. I mean, I'm sure there are South Sudan experts in this room much more so than I. For us, for the Peacebuilding Fund, South Sudan is not a high priority country. It's not one of our big recipients. So I don't proclaim any great expertise about South Sudan. I think what was a liberation army and what was, or freedom fighting army, or however you want to characterize it, brought in lots of people from all sides of society in South Sudan. It's a big army. They all got a raise on the day of independence. It consumes a lot of the budget in the South, and something needs to be done about it because it's not a sustainable situation. So somehow the army of South Sudan needs to move from being a liberation army into a Republican army that is fit to the external security threats of South Sudan. That's a long painful road to which we're at. So DDR, I mean, maybe what I can say that's more interesting about DDR, in Central African Republic also, DDR is a big issue. You know, it's a challenge because there's this interesting discussion between Bangui and the United Nations folks on the ground in Bangui and the headquarters world, people like me that live in very comfortable New York and have a nice life in New York. And what we say in New York is we can't do DDR again in Bangui because we've done DDR several times now, and every time we just recycle the same people, and then we pay the same people to give up their gun, and they go back to the community and they take the gun again. And clearly DDR has not worked, so we're not going to do that again. We're learning our lessons as policy people in the capital city. And poor SRSG guy sort of calls back in New York the next day and he says, okay, fine, let's not call it DDR, call it what you want. But I have a problem because I have ex-Celica folks running around killing. I have anti-Balaka who are day on day becoming more organized and more violent. I've got the FACA, the armed forces of the government who are not being paid and who are either with anti-Balaka or on their own. And I need to do something about, if you want us, the United Nations, to do something about law and order and security, we need to do something about all of these people who are organizing violence outside the state. And so how about we disarm them and move them somewhere and get them out of the streets? And if you don't want to call that DDR, then fine, but we need to do it. It sounds a lot like DDR. And the problem that we confront is that although we recognize the weaknesses of a traditional approach to DDR, and CAR, traditional DDR, you have very strong rebel groups that are well established and good command and control. And when you get the leaders into a room and the leaders make a deal, the deal sticks, and the deal works its way down the chain. In Central African Republic today, that's much less likely to happen. So DDR doesn't work, right? So there are no magic answers to this. We will use some of our funding in Central African Republic to canton the ex-Celica. So it's not DDR, but it will get them into camps where they are both protected and disarmed because they're actually at risk themselves. But there are big challenges around this because sorry.
Do you want to comment on the session?
Oh yeah, sorry, yeah. How are they received by governments? In general, I would say governments are. It's new for them. The responses range from not really being sure that it's right to outright resistance. In the concept of the New Deal process, which we haven't talked about today, but in the development of how the New Deal itself would be measured, there was some resistance from Timor-Leste, from the Minister of Finance there, who's one of the champions of the New Deal as a whole, to not do perception surveys. Her justification for that was that it was too soon. It's not fair to hold such new and fragile governments to this level of sort of population surveys so quickly. Myself, I don't buy it. That was her answer, but it's an indication. I think there's a lot of resistance for it. Interestingly, and I'll look at the title here, see what she says, the signals to me, but we get a lot of, I think, resistance from our UN partners on the ground. So our UN partners on the ground implementing projects, they want to implement the project. If they're supposed to hold the training, they want to measure that they held the training. And maybe they'll measure whether the people at the end of the training learned something. But what we really want to measure is, did the police that received the training, as a result, did they behave better? And really, you only get at their behavior by asking citizens. So, I mean, lots of places I live, the local police are something you avoid. I've done it myself. The checkpoint's there, let's go this way, right? So, so we also have some struggle with our own UN partners. And they're resistant to do it, I think partly because they're a little bit nervous that actually maybe the training's not really helping. They know that. Or they're nervous about the political implications of such a thing. UNDP issues a survey that says population hates the police, and we're doing the police support project, and they're a little nervous about their next meeting with the Minister of the Interior. So, so on a lot of fronts. But I think it's what makes my job fun is that we actually we don't have to shy away from the political. Indeed, we're absolutely supposed to do it. So we continue to. It's a slow thing, right? It's slow. But we're going to insist on it.
Thank you very much, Brian. There's a lot of good proposals in your presentation, and I think for this an hour more discussion. I'm sorry we went on for a little bit longer than we should, but it was perfect. Thank you
Thank you.
very much, Brian, and thank you very much, Martin.